Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll move to item number 2. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Patrick Radebe, our first speaker from City Power, who's going to talk to us about the regulation in the work. The Sheikh manager is served as an acting general manager in the City Power Exco. He served on the Department of Employment and Labor Advisory Forum and served on City of Joburg. He's holding a trade test electrical MAP from BETS and BTech access to experience. Thank you so much. Thank you once again, Mr. Radebe. Over to you.
Okay, my preamble there will start by the theme of the Occupational Health and Safety Act in terms of the legislation and its regulations. You'll note that the Occupational Health and Safety Act is an overarching legislation in the workplace. It actually provides for health and safety of persons at work and the health and safety of the persons in connection with the use of plant and machinery and the protection of other people at work against any hazard that may arise of or out of or in connection with their duties and activities of the organization. And therefore, the same act makes provision for the advisory council to ensure that all incidents that are actually listed, may it be an incident related to an issue of economics or an incident related to any other that may have arisen out of. So now this OSH Act, as we are in the Republic of South Africa, it is an overarching act over all other organizations or employer, where there is employer-employee relation. And this elevates now the issue of concern that everyone in the workplace is actually susceptible to be actually protected based on the rights of occupational health and safety, which is an element that, previously with the MOS Act was even least. I wonder if economics would have suffered the worst of that situation with the MOS Act. So the advisory councils are even, platforms that in smaller or fractional measures that would be organizational specific. When I say organizational specific, it starts in your shared committee levels. That is where information can be shared, where employees can interact with management, and they will have the opportunity to raise concerns that are in relation to what they are exposed to or what they've actually identified as hazards and risks. Now, economics has always been a subject of content because it was deemed by employer as a tedious element of identifying hazards that are related to. And we tend to focus as organization on our line in hazards that and risks that are in line with our construction work. And those are highly regarded as hazards and risks that we focus on. However, the economics thereof is also an element that should prevail, and it will align to the hazards and risks pertinent to executing any activity. And that, for me, is an issue that the regulations is tending to deal with. Now, if I go to the next slide, I would show that the OSH Act as an internal or Republic's approved or passed law is also subjected to, the international labor law. And now if we miss, or it is investigated that on our incidents, there are elements of economics, it will have a similar impact to the injury at work or the risk of injury at work. So it takes priority as well, that the economic factors are party to what we will actually have had in our HIRA or hazard identification and risk assessment forms, or including the policy documents as well as the SOPs. Now, with information that we get from the International Labour Organization, that actually highlights another element of concern, that for every 15 seconds in the workplace, a worker dies from work-related accidents. Now, one would deem that economics may have a very small contribution to that, but analyzing the incident reports or findings and recommendations based on our incident investigation reports, it may also highlight an element that we may have not considered as one of the hazard or risk, which is economically related, because we see economics highlighted or heightened only in the office space. Now, when you get to the workers level in the workplace, then it also says there would be 160 workers that would have had incidents or accidents, 160 employees within a 15-second period. And what does that mean? It translates to, by the end of each and every shift or day of duty for employees, there will be 1 million workers that will suffer from a workplace accident or incident. And this includes exactly issues that may have been related to economics, since we said that incidents may have arisen out of and in execution of duties. And therefore, economics is definitely one of those that may have contributed to that 1 million incidents or accidents that we would have accumulated per day, which is now in worldwide analysis and statistics. And every day, around 5,500 workers will be actually would have been booked off out of incidents that are work related. So this should be a scary figure or a concerning figure, that even issues as minute as we think in terms of economics are actually contributors to the findings of investigations that would have been accounted for in terms of ILO. So therefore, it heightens the issue of economical factors in the workplace, because in terms of handling of tools, in terms of executing work or a task, that factor remains in line with economics. Now, let us look into what happens if there are elements of ignorance or other systems that are not in place in our workplace. As accounting officers, it is a critical measure for us to note that the role of a CEO, it's not a cushy and a pleasurable task. It may be a high-earning portfolio, but the issue that it comes with accountability for every employee that would have been tasked to do or execute or perform any activities on the employer's instruction or based on the employer's instruction, that accounting officer, as the CEO, he would then, or he or she would then be having to be summoned to court to go and answer or be answerable to how did certain incidents occur in the workplace. So this is one of the CEOs that actually went through the trauma of coming face to face with legislation and regulation and all other relevant case studies that he or his systems or her systems were not in order in relation to us actually maybe demeaning or taking for granted elements of even economics in the workplace. Now, what is this economics that we are talking about? It is always an element that may seem to be a minute element. However, it is simply specifying an element of a human factor. Now, when we talk of human factor, we all know world-class organizations deem themselves to also recognize the human factor, which is deemed to be strategically heightened in the HR space, that human factor or human resources are part of our critical resources. And now the science. Hello? Oh, okay. The science of the discipline concerned with undertaking of interactions among humans and other elements of the systems, and the profession that applies theory, principles, data, and methods of design in order to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. This is now simply put in terms of what would be economics. So that puts us on the spot in terms of us highlighting the issues of regulatory and legislative requirements for us not to neglect the element of economics, because economics says that designs and modifies the work to fit the worker. And it cannot be the other way around. So if economics designs and modifies work to fit the worker, so meaning for every workplace or every tool that we deploy or issue out for our employees, we need to consider that it would fit the worker, and not that the worker would have now to actually fit the work or fit the workplace or fit the facilities that it has been issued to, or he or she would have to be exposed to in performing their duties. And it focuses also on eliminating discomfort and the risk of injury due to one executing work. That is economics. So those two bullets should be clearly understood in terms of ensuring that even if you issue a mere computer, the screen, the size of the computer, I know we are living in modern times and we use laptops, we use smaller gadgets, our cellular phones. You can imagine what impact that has, where the employer would say, perform your normal duties using that particular gadget at all times or 8 hours a day. So this would definitely create a situation that is not in line with the economics of the workplace. So the economics are also applicable even when you drive your vehicle, even when you are at home. So this dynamic is a dynamic that we cannot really neglect. Hence, it was identified as one of critical elements in the workplace to be considered. Now, the stressors in terms of economics. The stressors in terms of the economics would then be considered as a force required to complete a task. A force, it means we may need an energy, we may actually exert ourselves, we may actually need an element of effort to ensure that the task is completed. Now, that's already an economic stressor. It may be, I don't know, one would also consider a psychological element now to say if that is not a considered element in terms of economics. Let's think about it. Any awkward or static working posture adopted to complete a task present as an economic stressor. Now, an awkward position, it means already a posture, it means already, so these are critical for us to remember at all times, at always. Now we have arrangements for people working at home. working at home or working from home has actually an opportunity for us to review what we had in terms of our procedures, SOPs, in terms of our policies, to consider that working from home, one may not have a proper desk, one may not have a proper sitting arrangement whilst they're performing their duties. Number of breaks in terms of considering the issue of posture, because you would be seated using a bench that doesn't have a back lumbar support. You would be seated, not sitting at the right angle, looking into the computer. These are economical factors that create and become an element of contributing to the stressors. And the repetitiveness of a task. Repetitiveness of a task, when you continuously do something and it contributes towards a stressor, for economical stressor, we can actually make, in our constructive environment, we can make an easy example, i.e., one has to dig a trench manually by hand, not using equipment. One will have to raise a pick up high. One would have to dig in deep with a shovel continuously until they continue the task. These contribute to all the number of stresses that we actually have referred to here. So it's the force required to complete the task, it's the awkwardness, the positioning, the static working posture. It is actually repetitive of the task or repeating yourself executing a particular task. It falls aligned and spot on with what should we do as employers in terms of addressing the economical stresses. So if the International Standards Organization is assisting our systems, as we now all strive to actually acquire or for our business to operate at that level, in the ISO level, it means that you will start from policy to process or procedures to even monitoring. When auditing happens, we even will have to go to site and see what did we and how did we identify these hazards and risks that are related to economic stresses, because of one reason and one reason only. Economic designs modifies the work to fit the worker. I know that one way of dealing with that part may be for us to introduce plant equipment, but there are areas that we know that you'll be exposed to, that you may not be able to use the plant or the equipment, motorized equipment or and hydraulic equipment may not be feasible for you to execute your tasks when you actually have to perform certain tasks that you'll be employed to execute by the employer or by a partnership or an agreement that you've signed to execute certain tasks, as you may be contracted to perform those tasks due to maybe existing network or underground network may be utilized or currently in use, and the risk of you infringing on that network or defaulting, damaging the current network. So you may actually revert back to the manual labor, which will require you to have considered these when you actually develop your own procedures and identified in your hazard identification sheet or manual that people will have to execute. Now, when we look at the management responsibilities in terms of the economical issues, the same ISO standard, the same legislation talks to the management responsibilities, the accountabilities. So the roles and responsibilities would also be considered again, that if you have a supervisor supervising your staff, the manager in the office space, the manager on the field, project managers will remain accountable in terms of these procedures and systems to ensure that the execution of all the tasks that we are objectively wanting to execute on the day are performed in a manner that would not have impact in in a negative impact, for that matter, in the human factor part of things, which is the economics of a person. Now, every activity will require effort. The Occupational Health and Safety Act says we need to identify that in line with who is going to execute such. And therefore, we are supposed to be presenting a forefront that will present us as a visible and felt leadership as organization. And how do you present such whereby employees are still being looked at, or hazards and risks may not be entirely covered in terms of what would have been identified. So we are actually put on the spot as management, as leadership, as company owners, as project managers, to ensure that we have done the spade work of ensuring that we are aligned to what legislation requires, and we are aligned in terms of what would have been the requirements of the regulatory related to, in fact, including economics, whilst we conduct our own hazards and identification of risks. And even policy level, it cannot be relying on employees. However, policy is one tool that would be actually focusing on how did we establish ourselves as a company, how did we put together a process, and it has to be informed by policy. We need to lead by example. We need to participate in monitoring. Monitoring starts by site visits to ensure that we, even in the office space, when you visit and you look at your staff performing their duties, these are job-specific issues or work-specific issues that requires us as leadership to ensure that we are actually privy to all hazards and risks, and we did not leave out anything. And we considered what would have been submitted as feedback from the level of the check rep or safety rep on site, or even labor union representative, collectively discussing issues of hazard and risks in the workplace. Provision of the resources is also informed by what would have been policy, what would have been regulated in terms of our SOPs, where we recruit the right skill for the right job. And then there will be issues of consistency that relates to the discipline of how we should be conducting ourselves when we perform the duties. So there's a lot of focus with economics to leadership and management, a lot of focus that we would have had to consider in making sure that our procedures and resources are streamlined and we covered all risks and hazards. Now, the domino effect has always been a principle or a system that we will explain a lot of other processes that we need to execute in the workspace. Now, the lack of controls would deal with the element of regulatory requirements, ISO requirements, control documents like even attendance registers, even the workplace risk assessments that would have been, having to be filled in when we are in the field. We hope that workplace risk assessment, even the office staff, will start filling in terms of making sure that every hazard and risks may be identified. I know that every risk-driven environment would say there's minimum risk in the office. However, there should be then a periodic inspection that will actually inform us as organization leaders, accounting officers, to make sure that even the delegation of authorities that we execute is actually well informed and we are privy to what was escalated to management and what would have been remedial actions. These will fall in the control element of the first domino, which is the lack of control. So there's a lot that comes to management and to minimize the job factors, because economics will fall under job factors, although it's a human factor element. But it will have a lot of impact towards job factors, because the conditions that we will be exposing our employees to would actually prevail as an element of job factor. So you can see economics will hit on all three first dominoes that we do not want to drop down. And economics will definitely lie under the engineering factors, because it's how we design the workplace for the employees, or the human factor element. So even when it will actually result into affecting humans or people at work or workers, to an extent that they end up having to be exposed to incidents or accidents that end up affecting them and making them executing unsafe acts, taking shortcuts, maybe tiredness, contributing to one having to, flout the SOPs that exist. So there's a lot that we need to consider here when we look into economics, as much as we have considered the other elements which are directly executing our tasks for the day. Section 8 will focus definitely on us, and it clearly defines that whereby there will be legal appointments as the Act requires, and the same ISO standard requires. It is then Section 8 that will be utilized or implemented against the duties of employer. And those duties include economic factors. And the Section 8, it says that we as employers or the employer shall be able to ensure that the workplace or the work performed has a person that is actually capable of identifying all risks and hazards. Now, that person is definitely a supervisory level, and upwards it goes towards the top management into the accounting officer's desk. Now, the meaning of these appointments are also squarely based on competencies and responsibilities and accountabilities, and that it gives the element of appointing supervisors legally, whether it's your junior staff level supervisor, they may be actually exposed to a risk that when charged with legislation, they should know their parameters in terms of clearly outlined geographical area of responsibility that should be actually clearly informed to the person to say that they understand the responsibilities that they carry, because the accounting officer remains the one person that will account for everyone's activities. And when it comes to prosecuting the accounting officer, that person may end up standing in the court of law, having to answer due to delegation of authority or delegation of duties that may have come from the 16.1 or the 16.2, or even the GMR appointee, which is General Machinery Regulation. For that use of machinery on site, we may need to have appointed a GMR appointee. It may range from Section 2.1 or even 2.7, which if machinery is not in good working order, we may have been accounted, we will account for such duties or execution of responsibilities. And therefore, it says if we've missed one element in terms of the economic factors, we will have to account as management. Now, processes like your site visits, job analysis, hazard identification and risk assessment, verification of SOPs if employees are still performing accordingly. We cannot negate the fact that economics will remain part of those requirements for us to ensure that when we do such, we are aligned to the regulatory requirement of not negating the element of the economic factors. When we review our processes, where we do management review, we will also heighten and remember that the risk of economical factors are always there. Now, in the times of COVID, it means the workplace has shifted from your normal office working space, but to home. And the regulations are now saying, how are we going to deal with such? Because the workplace has moved from your place of work to your home or to your place of living, where you need to create a workspace and perform your duties in accordance and considering economic factors. Are we now supposed to be considering that our employees, when they work from home, would have a proper office chair that would be meeting the requirements of economics? Are we considering that the workplace, when we work from home, would have the right desk to work from? I've seen some actually a bed or a table, small tables that actually caters for placing your laptop if you are seated on a couch or you are sitting on bed. It is an effort to ensure that we consider the economical factors. Even some of the procedures that we review should now review we should now review a procedure that would also inform our employees that you need to take certain breaks after working for so long in a discomfort position. You need to perform optimally. However, it is also considered that there should be rules and procedures that will also inform employees to say how they should conduct themselves when they're doing the work and working from home. That, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to almost the last of my slides, that as gloomy as it looks from a distance, but we now know that there is an economical factor that we need to consider, and it is regulated, it is legislated. However, it always seems impossible until it's done, says Mr. Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela. We borrow from him. And thank you very much. If there are any questions, we will hear from the coordinators of the webinar. Thank you so much.
To those of you just joining us, you are most welcome. I would like to also like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Byron Nikodia, who will be highlighting the major changes brought on by Occupational Health and Safety Amendment Bill 2020. Mr. Nikodia is one of the ENZA construction shed manager, a registered SACP, CMP, and registered by the South African Quality Institute as a senior member. He has been in the construction industry for more than 10 years. We welcome you once again. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, ma'am, for that brilliant introduction. I accept all the good things that you have said in good faith. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Byron Lacordia, as you guys were introduced to. I'm going to be speaking a bit on the Amendment Bill 2021 and our perspective of what the changes are. We will be going through a little bit of the major changes, and then fines and omissions that will be given to guys that do not basically comply with the changes in the bill. So we've got a presentation up, but again, as I explained, we're going to use it as a reference point. I've got Ms. Pindile Kumalo basically handling that. So before we kick off, just with regards to some COVID management stats, basically the pandemic that is running through the entire world, but just some stats at the time of the preparation of this presentation, I know it possibly has changed. We are now sitting at 208,709 active cases as from the 11th of July. We have 151 deaths as from that date, and the recovery rate is sitting at 87.6. Just some information given to with regards to COVID and COVID management. Okay, so just with regards to some key additions and definitions, we're going to be reading off the slides there. So some definitions that have changed within the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the addition of adverse health effects in terms of danger, The definition of hazardous chemicals, hazardous substances, has been aligned with the Hazardous Chemicals Agents Act 2021, which stands and has aligned itself to the UN Global Harmonized System and various controls therein. Okay, so in terms of the definitions and that, we have basically identified most of the definitions that have been changed or amended in the Act itself. The implications of these definitions will have direct implications on labor-only contractors within the construction industry, as well as common law distinctions between employees and independent contractors. Okay. So moving on to the sections or the actual changes to the Act itself, we're going to concentrate and start off with Section 7 of it. Okay, so the Chief Inspector now, in terms of Section 7 and the actual amendments to Section 7, we're going to go through some point factors that we have as a organization identified as key factors in the different sections or amended sections of the Act that will have implications on what we do in industry. So the Chief Inspector can now instruct an employer to develop and implement a health and safety management system, whereas before they couldn't do the instruction, they would basically go in terms of what legislation requires and then measure and monitor accordingly. So in terms of Section 7, the safety management system or health and safety management system means a coordinated, comprehensive set of interrelated or interacting elements to establish the occupational health and safety policies and objectives of the policies in order to optimally manage the health and safety systems. This proposed change to Section 7 of the Act will currently is limited to the health and safety policy. So with regards to your management system, as we all know, your policies is derived from or governs rather the actual systems that you put in place. So whatever you say in your policy must actually marry in terms of what your management system says. Okay, excuse me. Because of these obligations in the construction regulations, they have documented risk assessments and health and safety plans. Such an instruction should not be challenged. So again, with regards to Section 7 and the amendments to it, the Chief Inspector can now instruct you in terms of the regulations and the requirements of those regulations to have a health and safety plan. And you have no right to say why. You basically got to listen to him. Okay, or him or, sorry. So in terms of Section 8, excuse me, of the Act will also be amended, requiring a documented risk assessment or risk management plan, which must be distinguished from the requirements to develop a health and safety management system. So in terms of your systems, all plans and assessments must be derived from that. Subsection 2 of Section 8 is amended and now reflects the logical steps of implementing a risk management approach. Excuse me. So in terms of that, so let me just pause my video. So in terms of, excuse me, in terms of subsection 2, we are now, we must have the risk-based approach. Normally it would be everything that we do is risk-based. So now we gotta basically identify what the approach to risk management will be, and we gotta display that. Sorry, conducting a workplace safety site-specific risk assessment thereafter, and developing and implementing our plans are now a must. Sorry, I think it's nerves here. So in terms of that, we also got to ensure that the workplace risk assessment is conducted by a person that is competent and also to pronounce all risks and hazards. So what before we used to identify was significant risks and hazards. Now we got to take into account what the risks and hazards are in the entire workplace, not only the high risk ones. So ensuring the workplace site-specific risk assessment plan is in place and now available at any inspector's request. Continuing on section 8, we also got to ensure that no work is undertaken unless the control measures contained in the risk management plan are complied with. So it's basically now we got to do a PTO on our risk management plan, and we got to do a PTO on the individuals that we actually do our plans with, or share the plans or train the guys with. So we got to ensure that our plans cover everything, and also ensure that the individual is carrying out what they've learned on the risk management. So we got to provide information and instructions, training and supervision that may be necessary and reasonably practicable to ensure the health and safety of our employees at the workplace. Okay. Still on section 8, we got to take all necessary measures to ensure that all requirements of the act is complied with by every person. Again, as we spoke about PTOs, observations, measuring, monitoring, whatever happens in the workplace in terms of risk management. Okay, we got to ensure that the work performed and that plant and machinery is also under the general supervision of a person that is trained on the risks and hazards associated with that. So it wasn't clear in terms of section 8, but now that they've made it an instruction. So causing all employees to be informed regarding the scope of authority. So normally we'd say that if this guy's example working on excavation, that team that's working on excavation must be trained on the excavation risk assessment. Now we're saying that everybody involved on that site, no matter what the scope of work is, excuse me, needs to be trained on the risk assessment. As well as the communication, again, same thing. Okay, so we're moving on to section 9. Section 9 has also had quite significant changes there. So the amendments to section 9 will basically be every employee shall conduct and undertake in such a manner to ensure that risks posed by identification, hazards to a person, and only those in direct employee of the organization who may be directly affected by the organization's activities are not thereby exposed to hazards to their health and safety, and the risk is managed in line with the risk management plan. Again, it all goes down to the risk-based approach as contemplated in section 8.2a. Section 9 is just reiterating that every single person in the organization that is exposed to risks and hazards must be trained on the risk management plan. Subsection 2 also is similar, but also applicable to self-employed persons. And it may read better than namely managed such risks in line with risk management plan, which means that every self-employed person, every subcontractor must be trained on the principal contractor's risk management plan, and they must also be measured and monitored in terms of are they carrying out, are they complying with the management plan itself. Moving on to section 10. Section 10 is also one of the sections that has been amended or proposed amendments. It's changed by removing reasonably practicable from the obligations on suppliers to ensure that the article is safe when properly used and that it complies with all prescribed requirements. So reasonably practical in terms of suppliers, service providers, to ensure that anything that is provided to or procured by the site needs to be used in the manner that it's intended for. This is quite a significant impact, and it's submitted that this is not a reasonable legislation. So when we say that reasonably practical has been taken out, we as an organization or as a committee, when we read through the proposed amendments to section 10, is saying that we have to be practical, we have to be reasonable when carrying out certain tasks, activities, when we're using the risk-based approach. Okay, it basically means that all suppliers must take all measures to ensure that the article that is procured by the site or they're providing or supplying must be properly used. So I think in industry, we are using that for now, because part of our measuring tools we're using in industry is the product that is procured or supplied being used in accordance to the manufacturer's specifications. Okay, carrying on to section 10.4. With regards to suppliers and service providers, I know we all have sold a car or bought a car, and we bought it with toots, okay, meaning as is. So the common law contractual principle regarding latent defects is not observable by reasonable examination, meaning we've procured basically a tool or piece of equipment, and what they're saying is we've provided to you in good standing. So we do a visual and we say, okay, it's good standing. The time you use it, it becomes a problem. And then it doesn't basically be, in terms of common law, basically it's our problem because we've taken it on. And that's where reasonably practical basically comes in, is that we got to be reasonable in terms of we've got this, it's under guarantee, it's under warranty. Do you have to take it back, or you must take it back? And that's not only our responsibility, it's also responsibility by the service provider. Okay. Reasonably practical. A major implication for all employees is that the concept of reasonably practical has been removed from many of the requirements of the Act. And this will mean that severity, scope, probability, and cost versus benefit factors will no longer play a role in the applications of certain obligations, such as health and safety training in Section 13, and the duty to impose on the Chief Executive Officer to ensure that the employees comply with the Act. So exactly what we're doing. We got to be reasonable on size. With certain aspects of our construction processes require us to be practical in terms of getting the job done. If we go by the book, and some of our buildings won't be standing by now, we'll still be working. So we're not talking about breaking rules, we're talking about bending into suits with health and safety in mind as well. So by removing reasonably practicable, it opens the doors to a whole lot of kind of things. Okay, but however, reasonably practicable has been moved from Section 10, but hasn't been removed from Section 8.1. As previously going through the sections or the amendments to the sections, we realized that in 8.1, they still speak about reasonably practicable. So what is the definition of it? The reasonably practicable means practicable having regard to the severity and the scope that is concerned again, the states of knowledge reasonably available concerning the hazards and the risks, and of any means of removing and mitigating risks and hazards. Okay, the practical thing to do, or the reasonable thing to do, is to identify it, mitigate it, and control it. So if we remove reasonable practical, it has a serious effect on the severity of the risk, the scope of the risk, and how do we identify these risks and hazards associated with what we do. Cost of removing or mitigating the hazard or the risk and realization to benefits and deriving thereof. Exactly what I said right now is, what are the implications of removing reasonably practical? Does it have a cost effect? But most importantly, in the health and safety of a person, it has a huge impact on that. Okay. Another section that has been amended is Section 16 of the Act. The changes are significant. Firstly, the concept of reasonably practicable has also been removed from the duty to imposed on the Chief Executive Officer to ensure that the employee complies with the Act. Secondly, an age-old question, whether the Section 16.2 appointee must further appoint Section 16.2, has now been answered in the negative. And so example, can a 16.2 appoint another 16.2 or an alternate? Okay, and that's an age-old question in industry. So we've posed those questions to the amendment, or to the council, the committee that are going to promulgate these amendments and change them. So the legal appointments are not common in legislation, and actually not common in international health and safety legislation. Environment legislation, whenever a manager or agent employee does not admit to the act, which it had been their task to refrain from doing on behalf of the employer, or he or she is liable to be convicted and sentenced in the respect thereof, as if or she were as an employer. So Section 16 has a huge impact in terms of what we do in industry, and the amendments to it is even worse crazy. Okay, so moving on to I think the most significant impact on the amendment bill here is basically administrative fines and fines that might impact our industry as well as our organizations. Is now an inspector is now empowered to ensure an administrative fine due to amendments to the Section 29 and the new Section 37A. So an inspector now can impose fines, whereas the chief inspector was only appointed to do so. If a person commits a breach of the act, the inspector may impose an administrative fine immediately. The amount may not exceed the amount the court would presumably have imposed in terms of the circumstances. Okay, Section 56, 57, and 57A of the Criminal Procedure Act applies. An admission of guilt fine paid shall be forwarded to the clerk of the magistrate's court, which has jurisdiction, and the clerk of the court shall enter an essential particulars in the criminal record book, meaning that you will now have a criminal record if you do not comply with the changes to the bill. It's an offense to persuade an inspector. So please, when the inspectors come, do not try and bribe them, because that inspector will just go straight to the office or impose a fine on you immediately. Administrative fines can only be imposed for certain contraventions. So in terms of the amendments to the actual bill, administrative fines can only be imposed for certain contraventions, such as not establishing a health and safety committee when required. Before you get a contravention notice, you close it out and you carry on with your day's work. Now we're saying that an inspector comes through and does an inspection on your sites and find that you don't have a committee established, is liable to actually fine you. So you can receive a fine for that now. Okay. So revised Section 38 is just about all the penalties that you can. Just some fines in terms of the different amended sections. Section 7, not developing a documented health and safety management system when instructed by, remember we said previously in the presentation, and now, excuse me, an inspector is allowed to give you fines immediately. So if you have not, or if you have been instructed rather to have a health and safety management system on site by an inspector and you don't, and on inspection he finds that you don't, you are liable to a 50,000 Rand fine. Section 19.1 of the Act, if you don't establish a committee, it's also 50,000 Rand. Section 20.4, not ensuring that the Health and Safety Committee meets at least 2 months or comply with that directive, 50,000 Rand fine can be given to you by an inspector. Okay, so there's significant amounts that can be imposed on an organization in terms of the fining system or the new fining system. Okay, drawing close to my conclusion, in society, going to get the justifiable return on the investments and amendments of the Act. So it's basically cost versus benefit, and if it is reasonably practicable. So we're not in agreement with the removal of the phrase reasonably practicable. Okay, in any lessons learned from mining in the respect of administrative fines, these fines were imposed on mining companies or mining sites, and now it's going into the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations. Okay, administrative fines. Administrator also fulfills functions of the judiciary, meaning that the chief or the inspector is basically allowed to give you fines, and he forms part of the legal team, and he's been given the authority to do so. Okay, that's my story. Thank you very much for anybody that was listening. And is there any questions, you may direct them to Ms. Pindile Kumalo, who is now taking over. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Mr. Byron, for the excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. Before we go to the next item, question and answer session, we will request Mr. Bbcbe. Request Mr. Bbcbe to give us a brief overview on how does ergonomic affect the workplace. Mr. Musi, are you there?
Yes, thank you. In fact, what I did, it was just the issue of just clarifying the issue of what do we have to have these economic regulations, and how do we these economic regulations work for who and how. Then my just taking was that to protect any person who may be exposed to economic risk, characteristics of action in the workplace conditions, or a combination thereof that may impair overall system performance and human well-being. The primary for economic, which I have stated, it was the issue of the high task repetition, forceful exertion, repetitive, sustained awkward posture, which I think Mr. Hadebe has just very much on that issues of how those things have to be, are coming up and how they are done. And then coming to the control measures in related with this economic risk factors, which we find that they are being measures, the issue of overtime exposure to the risk factors, which for the first one, we talk about the issue of first force, second repetition, and the posture. If you check what I've tried to show is that when we are talking about the force, how do the people have to put themselves in a force of thinking one can do it alone, and then that makes one to use the force in terms of doing the work, which causes the musculoskeletal disorders. In that sense, it's just saying that people need to understand the issue of sharing the work, and then the high repetition of the jobs that people are doing. And then mostly, if you also check when people are doing the individual's risk profiles, and most of the cases, we will find that people are the poor work practices that we are having, the poor health profiles, and then even the no recognitions of early warnings that are happening within the industries. People tend to find themselves in this economic situation risks. And then I did also look at the benefit factors that this economic has to brought in. If ever all of us, we have to look into the risk factors and then try to resolve them in a good manner, is that on the terms of the labor, we will have an improved health and safety, environmental well-being and safety of employees. In terms of the business itself, we will have improved productivity, efficiency, and prevention of occupational incident and accidents and adverse health effects. Within the government itself, a workplace that is safe and without health risks for employees. So in that sense, that it means all of us will be benefiting, and we can benefit out of all these instances. And then what can it can help us if ever we all just continue to do these medical surveillances with our employees, then that will help us in identification of employees according to economic risk assessments, to collect their medical chemical histories, periodic, health examination and regular intervals, the written reports that will help us in order to be in the same par with employees without this risk, exposing them to risk of in their working places. So, but the bottom line that I've come up with is that if ever all of us will have a systematically recognizing and controlling economic risk factors, this is an important part of your company's commitment to providing a safe workplace for all teams members. But the last that I think all of us we have to also take note of is that if ever we take serious note of saying our toolbox talk, we are done in all honestly, daily site task instructions are being done before any task can be performed. Daily tools inspection checklists and after work and daily work completed. That will help a lot. If ever we do have personal checklists, attendance registers, and also in all the work that we are doing in all our honestly, we do the risk assessment. That will help a lot in terms of dealing with the issue of the economic regulation or in terms of application of economic regulations. That's all that I try to do on my part. Thanks very much for that.